So in my previous video, we learned about auto layout and we became just auto layout experts. I'm going to link that here. Please make sure you watch that before you do this session, because today we're going to build a card together and we're going to use so many auto layouts and it's going to be a really complex card and we're going to go step by step to complete it together. So let's get started. So in our file, we have this card here, and this is what we're going to make together. So when I look at replicating this card, I'm going to first off have a think about how am I going to create this grid, right? Because auto layout is a grid. It can either be rows or it could be columns. I want to think about kind of the dependencies. If I go with a column approach, that means that it has to have one kind of width, right? And that means that if the title and the description aren't exactly the same width, it's going to maybe be a bit strange. Also, title has something blocking it on the right, whereas description doesn't, which means that description won't be able to grow all the way here because title can't grow all the way there because there's something blocking it. And because of that, I prefer to go rows rather than columns. So let's start with our first row, that action title and the chevron. I'm going to click on T in my keyboard and just click into the canvas and start typing. I'm not going to drag to create a text box. Watch my text video if you want to know why. I'm going to write action title. I'm probably going to use about 20 pixel size for my title and maybe make it bold. Yeah, just so it kind of follows along with this one. And then I need a chevron on the same row as it. So I'm going to grab this chevron from here. So I can hold down Option to duplicate it, or I can also just use the original one. The next thing I need to do is just put them into an auto layout. So I'm going to select both of them. And if you've watched my previous video, you know that our keyboard shortcut for adding an auto layout is Shift A. So I'm going to Shift A and add that in. First thing, I'm going to change the name. You know I hate having just random names in my layers panel, so frame 26 is not going to do. I'm going to call this top row. Now, right now I still don't know exactly how I want it to work with the spacing and all of that, so I'm just going to leave it as is for now. And then later on we can decide on the spacing and all of that. Underneath it, I've got this action description, so I'm going to click on T, tap in and say action description. Now this one needs to be smaller, so I'm probably going to set it to 16 and it needs to be regular. Yeah, that works. And then the last thing, I've got these circles and these over here. So I'm going to duplicate the circle holding down Option. Then I need another one. Then I need this little clock guy and I need some text that says 0 days. Maybe make this semi-bold and maybe 14. And it's also a bit gray. So what I can do, I can click on I while selecting the text box. So I'm not inside, I'm just holding down the text box, I, and then hover over here to get the eyedropper tool and select this color exactly. Now these four need to be inside of an auto layout. So I'm going to select all of them. I'm going to hold down Command while I drag to select all of them together. And I'm going to Shift A to add an auto layout. That's not exactly what I wanted, is it? So if these two are really close together, they're actually overlapping, and these two are close together, but then between them there's a big space. So obviously, because we watched the auto layout session, we know that all the children inside of an auto layout have to follow the same rule. These ones have one rule, these ones have another rule. We can't do that. I'm going to Command Z to remove the auto layout. What can we do? So like I always say, there are multiple ways of doing this. You could put these two together and group them. You could put these two together and group them, or put them into a frame and then put both of the frames or groups inside of an auto layout. But why not just nest auto layouts? So I'm going to select both of these circles and Shift A to add an auto layout. So they have negative spacing between them, probably, yeah, about -10. But you can see that over here, it's the first one is at the top, and right near here, the last one is at the top. I can change that in my advanced auto layout settings, and the canvas stacking is first on top, and then the 0 days and the clock need to be in an auto layout as well. So I'm going to select both of them and Shift A. 6 pixels between them, let's make it 5. And then I'm going to rename this. So this one is going to be called Deadline. This one is going to be called, I'm just Command Ring to rename it, Circles. Yeah. I'm going to select both of these together and then Shift A to get them in an auto layout of their own. I'm going to rename it Bottom Row. Now I'm noticing something is a bit off here. The 0 days and the clock are kind of center rather than being at the bottom. So I need them to align to the bottom of each other rather than in the center. So I can do that in my alignment section over here and just align them to bottom left. Now the next thing I need to do is just put these all together. So with action description, we could put it in an auto layout as well, but we don't really have to. So I'm not going to for now, and later we can play around and see what exactly we need it to do. I'm going to select all 3 of these and add them into an auto layout. So I'm going to Shift A. So now they're in an auto layout. I'm going to double click and change the name to my card. Inside, we see we've got top row, action description, and bottom row, and we can move them around if we need to. So let's first of all give it this stroke, give it this kind of outside border. It needs to be black. It's a bit bigger. Maybe it's 2 pixels. I see I have some rounded corners, so maybe about 10, something like that. Yeah, that works. I can see that I've got a background color, which is white. So I'm going to click on plus and it will add that. And then I've got an effect where I've got a drop shadow. So I'm just going to click on that. That works for me. Now, there is some padding, right? Right now, all of my auto layouts are just stuck to the border, but I know I have some padding over here. So let's see, I need maybe 10 pixels. And then at the top, maybe 15, maybe 10 as well. Maybe, yeah, 10 all around. I'm gonna make my rounded corners a bit bigger. Yeah, that's starting to resemble this, isn't it? Great. Now this, and I'm just gonna, let's say I need to really replicate this card exactly. So this needs to be a bit taller, doesn't it? And then this also needs to be a bit wider. Yeah, like that. Also, I feel like the stroke is maybe 3. Great. That's already looking similar. Now I'm gonna do this little bit later on and just focus on this for now. So that looks very similar. I feel maybe the padding actually needs to be 15. Hold down Command, click in to select all of the padding at the same time. Yeah, that's looking really good. So now let's look at the resizing of the children of this auto layout. So again, if you haven't watched my previous video, please go back and look at that because resizing could be a bit complicated if you don't understand it. So just go and watch that and come back. So let's have a look at the top row to start off with. So it's set to hug, which means that it's looking at everything inside of it and just hugging it. And the reason that it's hugging it like this is because we have 91 pixel spacing. So if the spacing becomes smaller, then it's going to hug it and become smaller itself. But I don't need it to hug, right? What do I need it to do? I need it to take up as much space as it can inside of the card, right? Because it has loads of space here and there's no reason for it not to take up that space. So instead of hug on the width, I'm going to set it to fill container. And like we saw before, it's going to still respect the 15 pixel padding that its parent is telling it. You've got some padding here, but it's going to take up as much space as it can. Now we know that the chevron needs to be all the way to the right. Okay, so we can go over here and just drag the spacing until it gets there. But if you remember from the previous session, we've got 2 spacing modes. Instead of packed, if we use space between, Figma is going to do that for us. So once I click on space between, what it did is it said, okay, I'm going to take care of this. The chevron's just going to zoop and go to the leftmost that it can because it's giving that space between. So now it's set to auto. We're not looking at it. Visual representation shows me that as well. It's set to auto spacing and it's aligned to the center. If we align it to the top, for example, you will see that the chevron goes to the top of that auto layout bounding box, and that's not what we want. So we want it to be on the center. Let's do the same thing here at the bottom row. So again, we need it to take up as much space as it can. So bottom row is going to be set to fill container, and it's going to respect its parent's wishes and have 15 pixel difference here on the left and on the right. And the items inside, we're going to do space between in a different way. If we click inside of this visual representation and click on X on our keyboard, it's going to change it to space between instead of packed. Now let's have a look at this one. So right now, inside of my card, it's set to 32 pixels. Let's have a look at what happens if I set it to automatic. Maybe it will look a bit more like the other card. So another way to get to space between, we've seen it from the advanced settings, we've seen it from the visual representation, but you can also just type auto into the spacing. Did that help? Not really. Right. The only thing it did do is you saw that this pushed this one a bit to the top, because before, if I set the spacing, let's say to 50, you see it grew too big for the card, and that's because the auto layout is set to fixed. So I told it what size it needs to be, which means it has to do that, even though I've got all of this padding and the spacing and all of that, but it has to follow in what I said. If I set it to hug, then it would adjust itself. But I don't want that. I know the card size needs to be 174 and it will forever stay 174 because that's what I decided. So setting this auto layout to auto spacing will make sure that everything inside of it respects the padding and stays within that bounds of being 174 in height, 15 at the top, 15 at the bottom, and then it will just let the rows distribute themselves equally. One thing we can notice over here though is that action description right now is kind of in between both of these, but in our top card it doesn't look like that, right? It's a bit closer to the title. There are multiple ways of kind of playing around with this, but I'm going to show you the way that I want to do it. Action description is just some text, and we know from our text session that we've got different resizing modes for text. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use fixed size. I'm going to say align to the top instead of align to the middle, and I'm just going to make this text box first of all, fill the container. So exactly like the other 2 rows, it's gonna fill with all that it can. And then I'm gonna say fixed height. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna drag it from the bottom until I get to kind of where I need it to go. Now this isn't an exact science, it's more just looking at it. I feel like that's close enough to the top. And what that did now is there's still automatic spacing between them. It's just a bit smaller because the central item has gotten its own kind of spacing that it needs right now. So that's great. The last item that we need to add is this little tag over here. So let's create a line. I'm going to tap on L, and that gave me the line tool. I'm going to hold down Shift to make sure it goes in a straight line. It probably needs to be about maybe like 8 pixels wide. It needs to be round on both its edges, and it needs a color. So I'm going to do the same trick I did again. Click on I to get the eyedropper tool and just grab this red color from here. Yeah, that looks about right. And instead of line, I'm gonna call it tag. Now this one needs to be on the border of the auto layout. So let's try that. Oop, nope, no, not what we wanted. Not what we wanted. How can we do it? So if you watched my previous video, you know that in order to break the rules of an auto layout, we need to use absolute positioning. So I'm going to drop it into here, into where the action title lives. And right now it's put the action title out of whack. This top row is a bit confused now, obviously, because it's set to auto spacing and it's got this additional kind of child inside of it. But when I go into my transform section in the layers panel and I turn on absolute positioning, I now control the X and Y. It's got the corners around it in the layers panel, so I know that this one, it's a child of this auto layout, but it's not listening to the rules. Straight away, action title came back to where it needs to be, but the tag is now on top of it and I need it to be here on the left. So I'm just gonna use my keyboard to move it to be on it. Now, there's a decision to be made with this tag, exactly where we should put it. We could put it in the big auto layout, or should we put it inside the action title? The reason I put it with the action title is because I feel like it's connected to the action title. So if the action title would become 2 rows, I might want this one to become longer as well, right? So I'm gonna do that now. I'm gonna set it in my constraints. Instead of just top, I'm gonna say top and bottom. And if you watched my frames session, you know that top and bottom constraints means that it's gonna look at the spacing it has between the top and the bottom of its parent. And if the parent grows, it's gonna grow as well. Its parent is this top row auto layout. So if title suddenly becomes 2 rows or 3 rows, that tag will grow with it, okay? So that's why I wanted it to be inside of the top row auto layout and not just inside of the big card. So if you've followed along in a really short amount of time, you just built a massively complex auto layout. So round of applause to you. Whoop, 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 whoop. The next thing we're gonna do is something that I like to call breaking the card. And that means we've created this lovely design. Now let's put some real data in there and see how it responds to it. Because obviously we're not just gonna use this and it's just gonna say title and description. There's gonna be real stuff in there. And we wanna see that we've created it in a way that makes it so dynamic that no matter if it has, you know, a massive amount of text inside or just like 3 words inside, it does what we want us to do. So the first thing I want you to do is please just duplicate the card. I say this in a lot of my sessions. If you make something once and you now need to play around with it and tinker with it, just duplicate it. So don't work off the original one. Always have an original as a backup. So I'm gonna hold down Option and just drag to create a new one. And I'm gonna bring it into this frame over here. So I'm gonna rename it Command R and call it My Card Breaking, just so we have that differentiation. And in here, I see that I have this other card on top here that has more things in it. So let's see how this responds when I change everything inside of it. First thing, let's change the title. So I'm gonna hold down Command to get deep selection. Instead of double clicking until I reach my title, I can just hold down Command and go straight in, double click and say, create a card using auto layout. Okay, so it's good, but... So over here, we know that this is because it's on fixed size, so the width will forever stay 335. It can't grow. And I see that layout is a bit like, it's a bit too close over there. So what can I do? I don't want to just click on enter and create a new line because that's not what we want to do, right? We don't want it to be something that we need to do in order to make it go to the next line. We want it to just do it itself. So what we can do is, and again, we can do it multiple ways, but if we set this text box, instead of hug, to be fill container, something happened. First of all, I'm going to Command Z and do that again. When I set it to fill container, Figma told me top row is now set to packed. So if you remember from before, we set the top row to space between, right? We didn't want to tell it how much space needs to be between the chevron and the title. We just wanted it to do it on its own like that. But Figma has some things where it says you can't have this. And that's why I keep saying just play around. You're never going to break anything. Figma might tell you, oh, you can't do this, but Figma's going to tell you. So you can't have an auto layout say to its children to space between and then one of the children is set to fill container. That just doesn't work. So we need to decide how much space we want between them. So we know that we want this text box to be filled, which means that it takes up as much space as it can, but we want it to keep a bit of separation between it and the chevron, right? So we want it to have, let's say, maybe 10 pixels between that and the chevron. Another thing that we notice is that the action description is now really close to the title. So two ways around this. We can decide that originally maybe we need this to be a bit smaller, so there's more space. But what I would do actually, I would maybe say that instead of a fixed size card in height and auto spacing, maybe I'll say that actually the card should be hugging the containers inside of it, and now I can't have space between. And instead of that, I'm going to say I need 10 pixels in between. So I'll know that if this title becomes really long and there's more and more, this will forever stay 5 pixels between it and description. Okay, so sometimes you just change around your methods, and that means that this card will kind of grow in height. Another thing I could have done is instead of setting the card to hug, I could set the card to fixed height like before and say 174, set the spacing to auto just so it spaces out automatically. And I can say, instead of doing what I did before, I can say that the action description is now set to fill, so it's dynamic in its size, and then the card still can't be spaced between in this case as well. So it's up to you which one you want to do. I'm going to go back to the first option. So my card is set to hug, which means it will grow in height if it needs to, and this description box is fixed, so it will forever have 60 pixels of height. This tag, we already protected it earlier using constraints to make sure that it grows if the title grows, so we've done that, but we need to change its color. So I'm going to select it from the layers panel, click on eye to get my eyedropper tool, and go to green. Now let's look at the description. So I've got this description here that I could just copy. I'm going to double click inside, Control C, and then Control V over here. So something's different. In this card, it's cut after 2 lines, but over here, I've got space for 3 lines. If you remember from my text session, it's a fixed size container, which means that this is the size of the container and that's it. If you remember, we've got a kind of second option for a fixed size container, which is called truncated text. It sits here inside of the advanced settings, and what truncated text does is it says, I'm a fixed size text box, but anything that's outside of my bounds, I'm just going to truncate my text and put a ... or an ellipsis instead. So I need to have just space for 2 lines. And again, this is a design choice. I'm just going to follow along with what's there. But if you want to have 5 lines, have 5 lines. But I'd say 2 lines. I'm going to grab my text box from the bottom and just make it a bit smaller so it can only accommodate 2 lines. Because we have it set to hug, see that everything kind of shrunk down as well. And because we have this text box set to truncated text, it means that if there's less text that's inside of it, and it can accommodate it, that's fine. But if there's more text than it can accommodate, then it just puts an ellipsis to let the user know that there's more there. Let's look at the bottom row now. We see that in this example, we have 3. Now, because we designed this in a really dynamic way, and this is an auto layout, we know that we can just duplicate a circle. If I select this circle and just Command D to duplicate it, we know that it just duplicates it and we're fine. We can have as many as we want in here and they're going to respond to the same rule as the other ones before. And now we need to replace them with these emojis down here. So select any 3 emojis that you like, and I'm going to teach you a really neat trick of how you can replace something. If I Command C to duplicate this kind of eye roll emoji and then double click into my circles auto layout and paste it, Command V, it will just paste itself inside, and then I need to delete one instead. But why not use an amazing option in Figma called paste to replace? So I'm going to choose this cool guy, Command C, and I'm going to select the circle I want to replace cool guy with, and then I'm going to right click and say paste to replace. So we just replaced it. Okay, instead of having to copy and then delete the other one, it just replaced it. I'm going to select this one now, Command C, and over here, and I'm going to use the shortcut now, Command Shift R, and that pasted to replace. Great. Last one is I need to change the days over here. So I'm going to double click inside and say 15 days. So Look at that. Now this card is just perfect, right? We tested it out. We've put some real data in and we see how it responds. We've done some adjustments to make sure it responds the way we want it to respond. And again, this is super dynamic. So if suddenly tomorrow we decide, actually, we want the title as well to only be one line, then we know how to do that, right? We change the title to truncated text and then we make it smaller to accommodate only space for one line. Done. So we now know how to protect ourselves in this dynamic environment. If we decide that this card can always change size instead of fixed, it says hug and it changes size according to what's inside of it, yeah? So we now know how to play around with these to get our result that we want. And that is it. If you've watched my previous auto layout session and then followed along with this one, I can say with full confidence that now you are an auto layout expert. Okay, auto layout is not scary at all. It's really fun. It solves so many of life's problems. I hope you're able to follow along. Leave a comment below. Let me know how you're getting on. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you at the next one.